Okay, let's do this. So today is the Army birthday. Let's talk about it. So what should you know about the Army birthday, and what are we going to talk about today? Well, the Army was founded in 1775. So we generally think of the founding of the country as being in 1776. We're getting closer and closer to July 4th, 2026, which would be the 250th anniversary since the signing of the Declaration of Independence. However, the Army was actually founded a year prior. So the founding date of the Army was June 14th, 1775. This would be roughly 2 months after the initial skirmish that happened at Lexington and Concord on April 19th of that year. So the Army is established on June 14th, 1775. The very next day, the Continental Congress selects George Washington as the commander, and he basically has to raise an army that is capable of confronting and defeating the British. Okay, that's not what we're going to talk about today. I've written about that in the past. You can find, I'll link a piece on my Substack. I'll link it in the description where I wrote a little bit about that. And I wrote a piece 3 years ago today that was called Happy Birthday Army, but the subtitle was Celebrating an Institution Held Hostage. That's not what we're going to talk about today. Today is going to be a little bit more positive, and hopefully a little bit lighthearted. I mean, there's some serious stuff we can talk about too with this topic, but I don't want it to be too heavy or emotionally taxing. We'll keep it kind of light. But today, I want to talk about what I learned during my time in the Army. So 4 years at the academy, 19 years in uniform afterwards. So that period together, whether it was at West Point or whether it was, in the Army proper, what are the lessons that I took away that I have been able to apply more broadly just in life in general? Okay, so I'll give you, we'll call it 10, probably a little bit of extra credit because I think it's actually more than 10, but that's okay. The others you'll get free of charge. So, number one, anybody who has served in the military is going to talk about having learned about teamwork. So, teamwork, that's the first one that I want to mention. Now, these are not necessarily in any specific order. I didn't necessarily decide to place them in some sort of order of precedence in terms of how important they are or how significant or whatever. But I did list teamwork first because it's one of those that anybody who's been in the military is going to talk about the importance of teamwork. If you have ever watched a show or a movie about military service, you're going to realize that teamwork is paramount. Okay, there is this important idea that, hey, you are part of something that is larger than yourself. You are going to have to subordinate what is good for you to what is good for the team. Okay, the team is more important than the individual. That is one of the most important lessons you can learn in the military. It is also one of the first lessons that you will learn in the military. And even if you just watch movies in which they depict basic training or something, again, this is something that is typically instilled from the very beginning into new recruits, and it can often be instilled via some repetition and trauma, some mass punishment or whatever. But the idea there is that, hey, the team is only as strong as the weakest link. And so therefore, if the weakest link is you are putting the team at risk. Now, this is something that if you've participated in team sports or you participated in some other activity in which you are part of a team, is not going to be new to you. But this idea of, hey, your mistakes could potentially put other people at risk, perhaps even their lives, maybe framing it like that is something that will be new when you join the military, right? But I'll tell you a quick example of this. So when I was at West Point, again, you learn this day one. You're part of a team. The team will suffer if you make a mistake. If you're late, if you're not in the right uniform, if you do something wrong, it won't just be you, it'll be your entire team that suffers. So I'll give you a couple of examples of this because they're kind of funny, but they also they drive the point home. One of these would be formation. So when I was in my first year, plebe year at West Point, the plebes, those that were in their first year, were required to be at scheduled formations 10 minutes early. So you had to go down and you had to stand on what was called the apron, which is like this cement area right next to the parade field, right in front of the parade field. And there was typically a formation every day before breakfast and before lunch. So there were at least 2 formations each day. And you would, whatever time formation was, you would have to be there 10 minutes early, and you would just, stand there. And if you weren't 10 minutes early, then you were late. Well, here's what would happen. Typically, as plebes, all the plebes in your squad or in your platoon would get together in one room. So it might be in my room, might be in your room or whatever, but we're going to get together in one person's room. We're going to check each other's uniforms, and then we're all going to go down together, and we're all going to stand in our spot on the apron. And we're going to be there 10 minutes early. Okay, well, what happens when we are all gathered in one of our classmates' rooms and then someone's late for whatever reason? Well, now you have a choice. We can either all go down and so just won't be with us and we'll show up late, or we can wait for that individual and we can all go down together, but now we're all going to be late. Well, the right answer, and the upperclassmen will let you know this, you may learn it the hard way the first time, right? But the right answer is you wait for this individual to come, you all go down together, and now you're all late, but at least you didn't leave someone behind. If you leave that person behind and you go down and you're all on time, but you're missing someone, things are probably going to go worse for you. Now, if you think about just that simple scenario, right? What is that teaching you? Because what is the debate that's going on internally in your own mind? I'm here. I'm ready. My classmates are ready. We are ready and prepared. We did whatever we needed to do to get to formation on time, which means 10 minutes early. Our other classmate, for whatever reason, is not here, is not prepared, is not ready to go. But I still have to wait on him so that we can all go down together. And now we're all potentially going to get yelled at, but at least we're together. So there's kind of a mindset shift that has to go on there, because you're kind of working against your own self-preservation. But there is a lesson there. And the lesson is, hey, you're all going to suffer because one person is late, but if you leave that person behind, you are committing the greater offense, and then hopefully another lesson there is, hey, don't be the reason that your classmates get in trouble because you were late. Oh, by the way, sometimes somebody would be late because they'd be coming from class or whatever. But anyway, you guys get the point. In the military, the team, this idea of teamwork, here's another important aspect of it. So your team could be your squad, your platoon, or both of those kind of at the same time, right? But a platoon is bigger than a squad. Your company, which is bigger than the platoon. Your battalion, which is bigger than the company. The brigade, which is bigger than the battalion. The division, which is bigger than the brigade. So you are a member of all of these teams. And there will be kind of this like friendly rivalry, your squad against the other squads in the platoon. Your platoon against the other platoons in the company. Your company against the other companies in the battalion. Your battalion against the other battalions in the brigade. Your brigade against the other brigades in the division, et cetera. Right? And it can be very healthy, healthy competition, healthy rivalry. But at the end of the day, you're all still part of that larger unit. But you're each also part of other subordinate units, smaller units. And so you are very much a member of various teams at various levels. But yeah, again, your actions impact others, whether your actions are good and right and positive, or whether you are making mistakes, or whether you are weak and you're holding up other people. It will impact the members of your team. Okay, so number one, teamwork. Number two, humility. Why humility? Because one of the things you learn is that there is always someone better. There's always someone faster. There's always someone stronger. There's someone smarter. There's someone who is more competent. Okay, you are surrounded by people who are very driven, very ambitious. And if that weren't enough, a lot of times they're also just really good people. You know what is extremely frustrating? At West Point, I was surrounded by people who would be um, like geniuses. They were so smart with their classes. You know, they were like valedictorian of their high school or whatever. They're so smart, but they're also super physically fit. And if that weren't enough, damn it, they were also just a really good dude. So you just there was you couldn't be mad at them. You couldn't be mad at them because they were just a great person all around, extremely well rounded. You just had to look up to them. You had to admire them. Even if they were your peer and your friend, you know, you can certainly look up to your peers, but that is an important lesson. You know, whenever you are surrounded by people who are driven and they're high performers, it is an opportunity for you to be humble. You may have been the big fish in the pond that you came from, but now you're in a much bigger setting with other people who are also big fish, and maybe they're a little bit bigger a fish than you are, and that's okay. And if you allow yourself to learn from that, then you can realize, hey, maybe I'm not quite the hot shot that I thought I was, or maybe I can learn from these individuals, or maybe I have this strength, this skill set, but I can learn from someone else that has this other strength that can perhaps complement me where I'm maybe not as skilled. But yeah, it is frustrating. Another thing that was frustrating is whether at West Point or just in my time at the Army, I would come across these dudes that were like total nerds, complete goofballs, and yet they would still be like super physically fit. It was really weird, and they might be really tactically competent, even though they were total nerds. Those guys are out there too. Okay, so teamwork, humility. Number 3, confidence. Okay, so we just talked about humility, but what about confidence? And can you be humble and confident at the same time? Yes, of course you can, and you should be, because we should have a healthy balance of being humble, but at the same time confident in our own skills. Now, confidence is a critical component of competence, and there's always this chicken versus egg debate about, well, which comes first? Are you confident, which then allows you to be competent, or is it your competence that then allows you to be confident, or is it both, or whatever, or is it kind of an ongoing loop? That's we could debate that all day long, but one of the things that I heard early on in my days in uniform is this whole idea, and you guys have heard this too, but you know, fake it till you make it. So if you don't exactly know what you're doing, just be confident, and sometimes you can get by until you do learn what you're doing. And I think that's very true. I think I have done that. I mean, there were times in my career where I was constantly fighting imposter syndrome. The same thing at West Point. And you know, you can be surrounded by all these other high performers, and you can kind of tell yourself, man, I'm not sure I belong here, right? But you just kind of just try to just walk the walk, and if you have trouble walking the walk, at least try to talk the talk until you can walk the walk. And sometimes you can get away with that. Now, I'm not talking about trying to misrepresent yourself as something that you're not. That's not what I'm talking about. But just be confident. If you aren't exactly sure what you're doing, or you know that there are some things that you still need to learn, you know there are some experiences that you may lack. If you're confident, you can kind of make up for that until you get that requisite experience level, until you get a little bit more comfortable, and then your confidence will even take off, you know, that much more. Now, here's the thing. In the Army, because you have a lot of these like very driven people, you know, type A personalities, as they say, you can get by in the Army with being cocky, probably more so than you can in other areas of professional life. You can absolutely get by with being cocky as long as you can back it up. In the Army, that's okay, just because of the nature of people who are in the Army, the nature of what it is that you do in the military. You can get away with that. Now, you cannot be so arrogant that this becomes detrimental to the team. But if you're cocky and you believe in yourself, and you can kind of back it up, but you're still kind of, a good dude, then yeah, you can get away with it. Now, I will tell you kind of a funny story with this. So I was a very cocky lieutenant, and I was on my first, this is like 20 years ago. I was on my first deployment to Afghanistan, and my boss was on R&R. So he was on, 2 weeks, 2 weeks, on vacation. So he was out. So on the day that he left, I don't even know if he was out of country yet. I got into this this little a little conflict with our higher headquarters. Now, I worked in the operations section. I was the assistant operations officer. My boss was the operations officer, and I got into a little bit of a conflict with the operations section of the higher headquarters. These two majors, and I was a lieutenant. My boss was a major, so he's out, on R&R for 2 weeks. And yeah, the day he leaves, I get into this little altercation. Not a big deal, like a little bit of a conflict, a little bit of I can't remember exactly what it was over. It doesn't really matter. Just a little bit of a verbal spat. No big deal. And my boss is a major in the battalion. There's another major in the battalion that would have been the executive officer. So somehow I went up to tell the other major about it, or maybe he called me up. Maybe he had heard about it and he called me up. I can't remember. But I end up in the other major's office, the executive officer. Now, my boss, the operations officer, and the other major, the executive officer, both great dudes. Great dudes. But I work directly for my boss. I don't work directly for the other major, but he's a great guy. And technically, he is the kind of the second in command of the battalion. You'd have the battalion commander, who's a lieutenant colonel, and these two majors. I work for one of the majors. He's on R&R. I'm now talking to the other major. I go upstairs in our headquarters building, and I go into his office. Again, this is 20 years ago. I don't remember whether he was already aware of the situation, whether I was coming to tell him about it, or whatever. But if I recall, I think he'd already heard about it. Maybe he'd been called by the majors at the higher headquarters. Hey, you need to tighten up this lieutenant of yours. Anyway, I walk in. He tells me to have a seat, and I sit down. It's a very cordial, professional discussion. And on his desk, I see a copy of the book, which I have somewhere also, a copy of the book by Stephen R. Covey, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. It's a great book. It's a great book. So that book is on his desk. He has clearly been reading, and now he sees this opportunity to use some lessons that he has learned from this book on this lieutenant who kind of needs to be, reined back in. That's me. So I think he asked me what happened. I tell him, my version of the story or whatever. And he says, he just he starts going Stephen R. Covey on me. And he's like, hey, sometimes you have these conflicts and you have, these different entities that are coming together, and it's not always about win-lose. It's not always about you winning and the other side losing. You should be trying to approach this from such a way in which both sides win. Now, this is a lesson that does come from Covey, where he talks about in business negotiations, don't always approach it from a zero-sum game perspective. Try to negotiate a way in which you win and the other party wins. Win-win. So he's clearly using this, this Covey lesson on me. And I recognize it for exactly what it is because I had read that book. I had read it as a cadet. And he says to me, you should be, when you're engaging with these other parties or with the other higher headquarters, you should be approaching this from a win-win scenario. And I said to him, yes, but sometimes that's impossible. And that's when you have to realize that you're in a no-deal scenario and you have to walk away. So what I was doing was I was taking his Covey and I was countering him with Covey, because Covey in this lesson says, if you can't get to a win-win solution, then sometimes it's just no deal. You walk away and you just realize, like, hey, no hard feelings. We're just not going to be able to come to a deal that is mutually beneficial. So in this regard, he tries to approach me with covey. I counter him with more covey, and he's kind of like this lieutenant. There's nothing he could say. He just kind of had to like smile and laugh. And I'm like, sir, I see your Covey book. I realize what you're doing here, but I've read Covey too. So anyway, we just kind of had a laugh about it. So yeah, so confidence. So even when you're dealing with even when you're a cocky lieutenant, and you're dealing with your majors, you should be respectful, but you can still be confident. So that was probably an example where I let the cockiness get a little go a little too far. Anyway, that leads me to the next one. Leadership. Okay, so we've talked about teamwork, humility, confidence, leadership. Anyone who has been in the military is going to talk about leadership. West Point itself is a leadership lab. So leadership is I would say, just kind of the layman's definition here from my perspective, is where you can positively influence others to do what needs to be done to achieve some sort of common goal, even if they don't necessarily want to do it. And that part is important. It's easy to be a leader when it's obvious what the right thing to do is. It's easy to be a leader when you are asking people to do something that they want to do. Okay, the leadership challenges come when it's difficult to know what to do. The leadership challenges come when people don't necessarily want to do what it is you're asking them to do for a variety of reasons. And some of those reasons may even be good. There may be competing requirements. There may be, it may be one of these moral dilemmas where it's kind of like, okay, well, is this the right thing to do? Is it not? Or perhaps there are going to be certain impacts that come from whatever you do. So leadership is being able to kind of understand a lot of that and still positively influence others to do what needs to be done. Now, there are some people who would not necessarily place a value judgment on influencing others. There are some people who would say, hey, if you have the ability to influence others to do something bad or evil, that's still leadership. You're just leading them to do something immoral or unethical, illegal, or whatever. Others would say, no, there is an inherent value judgment to be tied to leadership, that it's not really leadership if you are influencing others to, do something bad. Regardless, influence is a currency. And I mean that in a very good way, in a positive way. When the reason that leadership is so important in the Army is because the Army essentially is made up of people. And sometimes you're going to need people to do things that are going to be very hard. You may ask people to do things that put them at risk, or you're asking them to do things that go against their own personal good for the good of the team. That's why it's so important to lead from the front, to show that you also are making those same sacrifices, etc. And they're all different types of leaders. And a good leader over here won't necessarily look the same as a good leader over here, because it's going to depend on your personality. It's going to depend on your character traits, but there will be some commonalities between different good leaders. You'll typically see some attributes that people have, regardless of maybe some slight differences in their leadership style. Good leaders tend to be very reliable, very trustworthy. They're open, they're transparent, they are clear communicators, but also they understand the timing of decisions. This is important in the military. When you have a leader, let's say a commander, who is being asked potentially by his staff to make a decision, sometimes it is important for that commander to say, I'm going to wait to make this decision because I want the situation to develop a little bit more before I make the decision, because I realize once I make the decision, I'm going to set into motion a whole chain of events. So I'm going to wait, let the situation develop a little bit more, then make the decision. Okay? That the ability to do that and the ability to recognize where that is permissible, I would say, is an important element of leadership. Understanding the impact of the decisions, but also kind of those decision horizons, the timing of when the decision can be made, etc. I've had one commander in particular And one thing that I appreciated about him is that, he was kind of the smartest guy in the room. And I don't mean that in a way in which he wanted you to know that he was the smartest guy in the room. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying he was a very cerebral thinker. He was highly, highly, highly competent, but extremely well-rounded. And you always trusted him to know exactly what to do. And I worked for him for 2 years, and slightly over 2 years, to include during a deployment. And I never saw him sweat, like he just always just seemed to know exactly what to do, and you could just always trust him. And that's important. Leadership is a force multiplier, right? So I'll give you an example, because sometimes you have to teach this to very like young leaders in the military. So you could take a squad leader, or take like a young officer who's a platoon leader, and just a very simple example. Hey, you are very physically fit. You're the most physically fit person in this entire company. But how come your platoon is not physically fit? Platoon leader, hey, platoon leader, you're the fastest runner in the company. You're the most physically fit person in this entire company. But your platoon's physical standards are below that of the other platoons. So as a platoon leader, you're not influencing your platoon to do something that you personally are very good at. Because here's the thing, a private can be a very good runner, and he's not necessarily in charge of anybody else, right? A private can be an expert with his weapon. Okay, but if you're a leader, it's great that you personally are physically fit. It's great that you personally may be an expert shot with your weapon, but you're a leader. So I need you to coach your unit, and maybe they're not necessarily going to be as good as you are, but they need to achieve a high standard as well. What good does it do your platoon that you're super physically fit, or that you're very competent in this area, if your abilities are not translating to your unit? You're a leader. I need every person in your formation to benefit from your knowledge. I need you to find a way to motivate them, to coach them, to influence them, so that they can raise their level of competency, or whatever it is. And I just say that as one example, but this is something sometimes that has to be communicated to young leaders. Hey, it is great that you are physically fit. Be physically fit. But like that's step one. Now influence those that have been committed to your charge to get them where you are in their competencies. Okay. Another thing that I'll say about leadership is, this ability to embrace uncertainty or make decisions amid, competing sources of information. A lot of times in combat scenarios, or even just in, like, when you're not even in combat, but just the nature of the military, how large an organization it is, and just the bureaucracy, a lot of times you're having to make decisions quickly amid dynamic environments, but also with incomplete information. And so you just kind of have to just do the best you can. And that requires a certain type of ability. And then when you make those decisions, getting buy-in from other individuals, and that could be before and after the decision is made, right? Also, understanding the difference between being liked and respected. You can absolutely be respected and liked. You can. The danger, though, is where you are liked but not really respected, or you are liked for the wrong reasons. That, of course, can lead to real problems. Now, if we're going to talk about leadership, let's talk about the next one, followership. So number 5, followership. In the military, leaders are also followers. Every person who is in the military, regardless of their rank or their position, they have a boss. Everyone in the military has a boss. If you're the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, you still have a boss. Even if it's the the SecDef or now the Secretary of War, you have a boss. So a good leader also is a good follower. In the military, you cannot get by without being a good follower. So even leaders, they understand their place in the hierarchy. They understand their relationship with their subordinates, with their peers, adjacent commands, but also with their superior, with their commander. Obedience is not weakness, and that's not the way that it's looked at in the military at all. But it is looked at as a necessary element of good order and discipline. You carry out the orders that you've given. Now, I've talked so much, and I'm not going to rehearse this here, about of course we don't feel any obligation whatsoever to follow unlawful orders, but that's not what I'm talking about here. You understand that let's just say in a combat operation, there's a very complex mission that is going to be carried out, and your command or your unit has one piece of the mission, but your success enables the success of another unit, maybe an adjacent unit. So if you're a battalion commander, your mission success may then shape the conditions that allow for one of the other battalions in your brigade to also achieve their mission, and thus enable the entire brigade to achieve its mission, which then may facilitate the division's accomplishment of the division level mission, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So just understanding your piece and that kind of like patchwork of different missions that come together that are all part of, this operational framework, et cetera, this operational tapestry, if you will. So it's important to realize that. Another thing is sometimes you gotta learn how to take care of your boss, and particularly in the military when you're on staff, your job is to really take care of the commander. And I don't mean that in some cover up for his mistakes or what, or if he does something wrong or illegal that you cover it up. That's not what I'm talking about at all. What I am talking about, though, is the way you do your job is to facilitate the commander's ability to do what only the commander can do. So you provide him with the tools, the data, the information, and the conditions, insofar as that's possible, so that he can make command decisions, so that he can do the things that only he as the commander can do, right? So I'll give you an example. Very, very simple example. So when I was a brigade executive officer, one of the things that I did was I was kind of in charge of the brigade commander's adjutant. So the adjutant would be like a lieutenant that would be pulled from one of the battalions, typically a very sharp lieutenant. And he would kind of manage the brigade commander's calendar and other kind of just small administrative tasks on behalf of the commander. So you have a brigade commander who's a full bird colonel who probably has anywhere from 23, 25 years in the military. And you have a lieutenant who has maybe 23 to 25 months in the Army and is maybe 23 to 25 years old, right? And so it can be kind of a daunting position for these young lieutenants. But also, I remember when we hired a new adjutant, I did some of the interviewing of some of these lieutenants that were candidates to be the new brigade adj or the new brigade commander's adjutant. And I remember talking to some of these individuals and some of the questions that I would ask them. And I remember once the brigade commander selected, so I did some of the first round interviews, trimmed the candidates down to a final 3, and then those were interviewed by the brigade commander, and he made his final selection. But I remember, as I would kind of coach these guys on how to be a good brigade adjutant, there were a couple things that I would tell them. Take care of the boss and handle stuff that you can handle for him to preserve his time so that he can do the things that only he can do. And then I would give like a very, very simple example. And I would say, take out the brigade commander's trash from his office. Now, why is that a big deal? Well, taking out his trash in and of itself is not a big deal, but it communicates a couple of things. One, it's a respect thing. Now, can a colonel take out his own trash? Yeah, I mean, of course he can. Okay, you don't think that when he's at his house that he doesn't take out his own trash or take it to the curb or whatever? Yeah, of course he does. Can he do that in his office? Yes, of course he can, and sometimes they will. But it's little things like that. It's not about the trash. The important thing is not the trash. It's about, let me do this little thing for you. That way you don't have to worry about it. So, I tell the adjutant, just at the end of the day, if the commander's still in there, just knock on the door. The door will be open most of the time, right? Just tap on the door and say, "Hey, sir, I just want to grab the trash." And he'll probably say, "Yeah, come on." And he'll be super appreciative. Okay. And just take the trash out for him. Just little things like that. No, you're not going to wash his personal car for him. No, you're not going to, cut his grass at his house. You're not going to do that. Of course, he would never ask you to do those things because that would be like absolutely inappropriate, right? But little things like that you can do. And again, it's not about the trash. It's about communicating to this young lieutenant in this case that, hey, there are small things that I can do, like these little things that I can take off the commander's plate so that the commander can focus on the things that only he can do, that only he as the brigade commander can do, right? Another thing is, so we had an adjutant in this position, and he told me one day that his wife was getting frustrated with the hours that he was working at work, or that he was, at the headquarters. Fair enough. This is a common complaint, and the commander would work long hours, and the adjutant a lot of times would work long hours. So one day, I said to him, I said, "Hey, when you've been at one of the unit events and your wife has been here, had the commander ever expressed to your wife his appreciation of what you do for him?" And he said, no, the commander's never done that. Now, okay, I'm not the brigade commander. I think that would be a great thing for the brigade commander to have done. He had not done that, but I made sure that I did it the next time. And I don't remember what the event was, but there was some event, and families were there, and this adjutant was there with his wife. And if I remember correctly, I think they had like a young baby. So I mean, they're a young family, and he's working a lot of hours. I certainly understand the strain that can put on a young family, particularly if they have a very young child, etc. So I remember, I approached the two of them, and I just very briefly just said to the wife, "You're like, thank you. Like, what your husband does it's a lot of behind the scenes stuff that seems very small, but it has a huge impact on the brigade commander's ability to be more productive as a commander. And what your husband does, and I know it's a lot of thankless work and a lot of long hours, but it has a direct impact on the brigade commander's productivity, which therefore means it has a direct impact on the entire brigade, which is, 4,000 plus soldiers. I'm not saying that this was some huge like moment of revelation for her where she was just like, oh, that's so great. Oh, I didn't realize that. I'm not saying that. I'm not trying to say that this was more than it was, but the next day, this lieutenant, the adjutant, did approach me and say, "Hey, my wife was really appreciative that you said that to us last night, that you talked about the importance of my work. She was really appreciative of that." So anyway, yeah, it's important to take care of the boss, but it's also important to recognize people's contributions. Later on, I was in a similar position as a lieutenant colonel to a 3-star. And, I mean, I took out the 3-star's trash every day. It was just one of those things. And he's a great dude, and just one of those things. He never asked. I just did it. I'd go in, take out his trash, and there were other little things that I would do just to, sometimes you just got to take care of the boss. Not a big deal. It's part of doing the small things, and that's next. So do the small things. Number 6, attention to detail. In the military, this will be hammered into your brain. At West Point, this is hammered into your brain. One of the things at West Point that you have to do your first year, I assume they still do it, but you have to, if there was a dessert like a cake or a pie that was on the table, there'd be 10 people at your table. If you're a plebe, one of the things you have to do is you have to cut that into the right number of pieces for how many people at the table want a piece of the cake or the pie or whatever, the mess hall is prepared that day. So there are these duties you have to do at the table, but one of these is announce the type of dessert and then ask who wants a piece. And you got 10 people at the table, okay? And so if 8 people want a piece, okay, cutting a pie into 8 pieces, not that bad. If 7 people want a piece, ooh, that's going to be real tricky for you to cut a pie into 7 equal pieces. And in fact, what people would do is people would have a little template, like a little piece of, cardboard or whatever that they would make. And they would have, they would basically have the lines drawn out for how you would cut it into, 5 pieces, 6 pieces, 7 pieces, 8 pieces, 9 pieces, right? Or 10 pieces. You would have like this template that has all these lines on it, and you could put that on top of it and use that to then make your cuts, to cut the even pieces, because it's just one of those things you're expected to do. Now, and if you cut the cake wrong or the pie wrong, then you will hear about it from the upperclassmen. And at some point, you will inevitably be told that you have killed your platoon, okay? So this is a common theme at West Point as a cadet. This is a common theme when you're in your first year and you're kind of being, hassled by the upperclassmen. And there's a method to the madness. It's not just because they're jerks or whatever. But the method to the madness here, and it'd be the same thing if you're like a drill sergeant, for basic training. And that is, in this case with cadets, you are preparing to one day be a lieutenant. That's one of the first jobs that you will have as a new lieutenant in the Army is a platoon leader. So with very little experience, potentially within your first year in the Army, post-graduation from West Point, you're going to be the leader of a platoon, which could be, depending on the type of platoon, anywhere from like 25 people to 30 to 40, etc. So the idea is, if you don't have attention to detail, you could make mistakes that could cost your members of your platoon their lives. So that quickly can become, oh, you made this seemingly insignificant mistake here on the table right here as a cadet, and that translates to, oh, you just killed your platoon. Because if you had made a similar mistake under combat situations a couple of years from now, when you're a platoon leader, you could have gotten your whole platoon killed. And so it's kind of, obviously it's hyperbolic. Everyone understands that. The lesson is important. The connection there can be made. You understand, okay, I got it. Attention to detail. I made a seemingly minor error, but in a different scenario, under different conditions, I could make an error that is seemingly as insignificant, and there could be disproportionately tragic consequences because of that. Okay, so that's kind of the lesson that is taught often via, repetition and trauma at West Point. And again, sure, there's some exaggeration there, obviously, but the lesson stands that, hey, attention to detail is important. Focus on these little things now in a relatively safe environment. Now, West Point was, it could be a rough place to go to school, and it was very hard and very challenging, but nobody's life is at risk, worst thing that could happen is you get, into a little bit of trouble, or you fail your classes, you get kicked out or whatever, right? So in that regard, it's a safe environment. So focus on these little things. Stress inoculation. You're constantly getting hassled. You're expected to do this, do this, do this, do this. You got all your cadet duties. You got all your academic, requirements, et cetera. You're trying to manage all of that. Just focus on the little things, and the big things will take care of themselves. Okay. And then what does that translate to in the Army? Well, just little things like standardization, because then it just makes it easier to understand what tasks are done when. Standardization, such as load plans in vehicles. Like, hey, this vehicle and this vehicle, the vehicle for the same type of vehicle for different units, but the same type of vehicle that has the same type of personnel that carries out the same task, that's going to have the same equipment. Well, it's loaded the same. Or your rucksack. You pack your rucksack the same as someone else's rucksack, so that sometimes in a combat operation, you learn this in Ranger School, Sapper School, et cetera, just to name some examples of schools that I went through. You learn that sometimes when you return from a mission or whatever, and you return to grab your rucksack, you may have to grab someone else's rucksack, and then what if you need something from it? If it's not your rucksack, and all the rucksacks are packed the same in terms of what is in the outer pockets, if you need to retrieve something, then you'll know what pocket it's in, right? And that could be something like first aid supplies, or a tourniquet or something. A lot of times people carry tourniquets on their person, but anyway, you get the point. So again, those small things that are seemingly insignificant, but they could have outsized consequences, either positively or negatively, depending on the conditions or the circumstances. Okay, so now with the small things, you can take that to an extreme, and you got to make sure that the small things that you're focusing on are the right small things. If you're focusing on these things that are really, really unimportant, then are they really helping you to prepare for the other big things? So that's where you got to be smart about the small things you focus on. I'll give you an example. So I was a platoon leader, and this is in the 10th Mountain Division. And if I had to guess, I'm going to say this is probably like 2005. So this is the year before the deployment that I would be on with the Stephen R. Covey book, that whole incident. So I'm a platoon leader, and for some reason, I can't remember if it came from the battalion headquarters or whatever, but we were being told to clean the company area. We had, and I think it was coming from the sergeant major or whatever, but clean like the walls, and clean the doors, and clean like kind of the kick boards, the little kick plates that are the metal plates that are at the bottom of the doors or whatever, that just get kind of accidentally scuffed by people's boots or whatever as people are going indoors, outdoors. Just this is in the office space in a company area. And we were like, okay, our company area is generally clean, not spotless, but generally clean. And we have other more important stuff to do than make this place spotless. That was kind of what I thought at the time. And I remember my platoon sergeant said, he said something like, a combat ready unit is never inspection ready, and an inspection ready unit is never combat ready. I still remember this, 21 years later, because I don't know where he got that from, but it was a funny idea, maybe slightly overly caricatured. But I get the point. Now I don't totally agree with that looking back on it now, but I get the point. There's this similar idea that you can either be a fighting dog or a show dog, but you can't be both. So these aren't necessarily true, but they can be. Okay, so what I like the idea. I get it. But I would take this idea of being combat ready and inspection ready, and what I would say is, well, make sure your inspection prepares you for combat. So what do your inspections entail? Now, do I think you need a generally clean working area? Yes. Do I care that it is 100% spotless? Maybe there's a point at which, okay, the time you're spending to get this from generally clean to 100% spotless is Could be utilized in a better way, sure, maybe. Um, so what are you inspecting? Are you inspecting things that are important, or are you inspecting things that are detracting from combat readiness? So do I agree with the idea that a combat ready unit is never inspection ready and that an inspection ready unit is never combat ready? No, I like the idea. I can appreciate the kind of the tension between those two, but no, I don't necessarily accept that they are mutually exclusive, but they could be. So you got to make sure that you know there is such a thing as pre-combat checks, pre-combat inspections. That's one idea of a type of inspection that actually enhances readiness or readiness. It enhances, combat preparation. So again, the small things must lead to the big things, the big successes. You got to be focused on the right small things. Number 7, kind of in line with small things, small victories. Allow yourself to take pride in the small steps forward. Don't allow yourself to get overwhelmed. Now, the best example of this is probably like Ranger School. So, I went to Ranger School, and the first time I went, I didn't make it through. I injured my eye. I had issue with my knee. All these things went wrong. Doesn't matter what. But anyway, so I went back about a year later, and that's what I went through, graduated, etc. But I would meet these other people who were preparing to go. And then later on, when I was a major or a lieutenant colonel, I was a battalion operations officer. I was later battalion commander. I was encouraging subordinates to go to Ranger School. And I remember, like, I remember when I went to Ranger School, and I would see these people in like the first day, and I could tell they had mentally defeated themselves. They were so intimidated by the fact that they were now at Ranger School that they had created this idea of what it was that was far scarier than what it actually was, and they were mentally defeating themselves. And so I would try to encourage people, particularly after I'd gone through and graduated and other people were going to go. But even while I was there, I remember just telling people just one event at a time that first day, because the first day can be, kind of intimidating. Just make it through the first physical test. Then there's another physical test. Then you got to go do like a combat swim test, get through that. Just get through these little tests and allow yourself to kind of, take some solace in the fact that you made it through that. So like, the first event, you pass it. You're like, okay, great. That's one small victory. Okay, the next one, made it through. Okay, that's another small victory. And if you can get through a couple of those and you start building a little bit of momentum, the next thing you know, you're a couple of days through. And if you make it through the first week of Ranger School, you got a really good chance of graduating. It's just don't allow yourself to get so intimidated in the very beginning. That's just one example. It's important to not overwhelm yourself. Create a mountain psychologically that you're going to struggle to get up, but it's really a mountain of your own construction. Okay, number 8, embrace failure. What does that mean? Things are not always going to go well. Sometimes you're going to commit mistakes. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to commit an error, whatever. There's going to be a failure. They may be small, they may be big. But at the very least, you're going to have some small failures, or maybe even some, mid-sized failures. And if it's somewhat small, just blow it off and move on. If it's maybe a little bit larger and there is a lesson to be learned from it, learn the lesson and then, move on. Let it go. If you can. If it's a more serious mistake, that there may be a more involved process in getting past it. But at West Point, I remember when I was preparing to go to West Point, and we would meet with cadets that were from the same part of North Carolina that I was from. And I remember this cadet who was probably a senior, and I would have been a senior in high school prepping to go, but he had a meeting with people who had already been accepted and that were going to go into West Point the next year. And I remember him meeting with us and our parents, and I remember him saying, hey, one of the lessons you're going to learn at West Point is you're going to learn to blow things off that don't really matter. I thought that was such like a peculiar thing, but also kind of a refreshing thing to hear him say, because I didn't exactly know what I was going to be walking into when I went to school there. And so to kind of hear someone say, listen, you don't, not everything's going to go your way. Some of it you're just going to blow off. And there was a lot at West Point that did not go my way. Um, okay, so you have a bad test in one of your classes. Okay, so you get in trouble for some minor infraction or whatever. Okay, just move on. And then in the military, so okay, you make some error, you get called out for something by your boss. If it's relatively minor or not that big of a deal, then okay. And if it is a little bit bigger of a deal, then embrace it, then accept it. I screwed this up. I made a mistake, and I'm going to learn from it. I'm going to do this to try and rectify the situation that I caused by the mistake, and just be upfront with your boss about it, or whomever else was impacted, maybe even your subordinates. It's okay as the leader to say, hey guys, I made a decision. I thought this was gonna happen if I made this decision. My read on the situation was wrong. I think this is why. And anyway, I apologize. I don't always get everything right, et cetera, et cetera. So I kind of talked before about how the upperclassmen at West Point, they'll kind of catastrophize everything. It's kind of their job. They do it deliberately. I did it when I was an upperclassman too. So I mentioned, the pie, but there are other things too. When you look at one of the plebes' shoes, do they shine their shoes? Is their room clean? Whatever, all these little things, their uniform standards, But again, it's easy to get overwhelmed with that stuff. But the lesson there is, hey, just let some of that stuff go. Just learn to just kind of manage it, filter out what's important. The rest is just kind of white noise. Now, there's a risk there. Don't mistake something important for something unimportant. Okay, so there's a little bit of maturity, a little bit of judgment that you have to exercise. But the stuff that's unimportant, you got to learn to let it go. And I'll tell you, I had some failures. I was not always successful at everything that I did at West Point. I was not always the top cadet. And then, I mentioned Ranger School earlier. I didn't make it through Ranger School the first time. I didn't make it through Sapper School the first time. I didn't even make it through the pre-Ranger course the first time. As a second lieutenant, I screwed all that up. But as a first lieutenant, a year later, I made it through all of that. And I remember my first year in the Army, I was like, man, I didn't make it through Ranger School. I went through Sapper School and completed, but didn't graduate because, I missed some of the requirements to graduate, and then I'm like, man, why am I struggling? I'm not sure if this whole Army thing is, maybe I'm not cut out for it. And then a year later, I go back to pre-Ranger, which I screwed up something the last time I'd been to pre-Ranger, but I go to pre-Ranger. Yeah, anyway, I get through pre-Ranger, go back to Ranger School, graduate from Ranger School. 3 months later, I'm in Sapper School. I graduate from Sapper School. And now my perspective is totally different, And I remember, so fast forward, and now I'm a major. I'm a battalion operations officer. And I know that I have a strong reputation in the unit, not just in the battalion, but in the brigade. And a year later, I would be selected to be the brigade executive officer. Anyway, I know I have a very strong reputation. And I know that people in my battalion, I know they look up to me. I know they respect me. I know that I have a reputation for someone who is, kind of squared away, someone who is extremely physically fit, and someone who's been through Ranger School and Sapper School, which in a combat engineer battalion is a big deal, particularly if you've been to both. And we were trying to encourage people to go to both. And we had these training programs that had been set up to help people prepare. And I remember sometimes having to tell like these young lieutenants or these junior captains or some of our sergeants, like, guys, you guys, because I kind of knew, and it wasn't about being arrogant or, hey, look at me. It was actually the opposite. But I would tell these guys, hey guys, you guys look at me and you see someone who's Ranger and Sapper qualified or whatever, right? What you may not see, because you wear the tabs on your uniform, what you may not see though is the second lieutenant that did not make it through Ranger or Sapper school and had to go back a year later to both. So, yeah, if you're intimidated about going, you should be intimidated because those schools are hard and they suck. But just prepare and go. And if you get injured or you don't make it through or whatever, then just come back, get healthy, smarten yourself up on what you need to know tactically and go back. It's not that big of a deal. It's going to suck while you're there, but just go and make it through it. And if for whatever reason you're unsuccessful the first time, just go back. And I met other people, to include one of my commanders that I would have later on, who was one of the most impressive officers I ever worked for. And he was telling me one time, we were talking about this issue, about kind of assimilating the lessons from some of the failures that you have along the way. And he told me, and this is a guy who spent a long time in the Ranger Regiment, for those of you who are familiar with that. But he told me how it took him multiple tries to get through Ranger school, multiple tries to get through Jump Master school, multiple tries to win his expert infantryman badge. And I just thought that was really interesting to look at this, like, super squared away, like the picture of what I consider the successful senior officer to be. This guy would go on to be a general, Anyway, so yeah, there are failures that you can learn from and get past, and they may help you. They may contribute to later successes. A failure now may help you have a foundation to build from that will make you successful in the long run. There are personal conflicts that I would have. I mean, I mentioned the one from that deployment in Afghanistan. Other little like tensions that I had with senior officers when I was a cocky lieutenant. I remember getting called into my battalion commander's office as a newly promoted captain, and being given some grief because I didn't have a great relationship with the major that I worked for at the time, but nobody had a great relationship with that major. But I learned from some of those, just me getting a little bit older, maturing, and realizing that a huge part of being in the Army is dealing with people, just like in any other organization. That's not unique just because you're in the Army. You still got to work with people, and you got to build strong relationships and strong teams. Okay, so number 9, problem solving. When you're in the military and you're dealing with some pretty complex problem sets at times, right? You've got missions you have to achieve. There are going to be time constraints. There may be limiting factors that impact your ability to do what you need to do in a time frame that is allotted, or limited resources, competing priorities, whatever, right? And you've got to figure out, first and foremost, how to frame this problem, understand the problem for what it is, and then realize, okay, how do I go about trying to, attack this problem, this complex problem set, right? And so the Army is really big, particularly some people in the Army, and thinking in systems. Now, that's kind of been a buzzword in business for a long time, but it is something that I think is important. And I think that when you look at like a military unit, you do have all these different systems that make the unit progress forward. And so just kind of understanding, well, there's your operations system, which may be your largest and your most important, but it's not your only system. Okay, you got all these other more administrative systems. You've got, your logistics systems. You've got your personnel systems. You've got your systems of how to ensure that your equipment is always up to standard, serviceable. You have personnel, not just in terms of making sure that everyone is paid and that you have the right people in the right positions, but also as people leave the unit and other people come into the unit, you got to make sure that all that is taken care of. There's just all this stuff that is going on. Your family readiness groups, like that's a system that has to be maintained. And so a lot of times trying to make sure that everything runs smoothly, that you routinize that which can be routinized that which can be routinized, right? That's important, just to make sure that you're kind of the system gears are constantly running without getting tripped up, right? Understanding second and third order effects. So, okay, if this occurs, that may set into motion this other chain of events. Well, what kind of effects is that going to cause? Understanding causality. So again, the relationship between cause and effect. If I do this with my unit, what are the effects? So I may do this and I mean to create this effect. But what I didn't realize was that when I did that, I elicited this other unintended effect, which was not as positive. So, now what do I do? Just kind of understanding that stuff. Prioritization is huge in the military and in any other, I would say, organization where you have a lot of requirements and you have limited resources or time. And so you have to figure out, all right, we can't do all of this. So what do we do? What do we do first? Or I want to achieve this outcome, but I know that to achieve this outcome, I'm going to have to do this and this prior. So there's a sequencing of events there to kind of set the conditions for what I'm actually trying to achieve, right? So just kind of that problem solving is very important. And that leads me to the next one, being well-rounded. So, in one of the things, when I was a brigade executive officer, in our what's called a brigade combat team, we had a bunch of different companies. I think there were like 39 different companies across the entire brigade, in 7 different battalions. And the brigade commander chooses the company commander. So you have a brigade, a battalion, and then the companies. So the companies are 2 levels below the brigade. And I was the brigade executive officer. And so one of the things that I would do as the brigade executive officer that my brigade commander would have me do, a task that he delegated to me, was when there was going to be a company change of command, which means one of the company commanders is moving out, he's being replaced by so-and-so, just because, the first guy's time is up, it's time for him to move on, and a new guy's going to come in. So I would do kind of an interview with the outgoing and incoming commanders. And the brigade commander would do one. So these guys would have a transition time in which they would go through, they would inventory all their equipment. That's one of the things that they would do. So the incoming commander has got to see all the equipment that's on the books because he's going to become responsible for all that equipment. He's going to have to sign for it. So he has to see that. So that's one of the most important parts of the change of command transition time, but also just kind of learning the systems that are in place in the company so that he's ready to take command because the other guy's going to leave, right? So as they would start this transition period and start their joint inventories, et cetera, I would sit down with both of them. Then they would go through their transition period, and then they would basically have an out brief with the brigade commander. And so when I would have the initial kind of the in brief with them or whatever, one of the things that I would tell these guys, particularly the guy who's coming into command, I would say to him, you're going to be a company commander. So this is a lot different than being a platoon leader or being a staff officer or whatever. So you have to be well-rounded. The command is going to require a variety of skill sets. It's not just your tactical acumen. That's kind of the starting point. We expect you to bring that to the table. But if that's all you have, then you're kind of still at square one. Okay. It's also understanding the physical fitness, the weapons qualification, the maintenance of all your equipment, the serviceability of all this equipment that you're assigned for. your family readiness groups, managing the funds. So if you're not very administratively skilled with a lot of that stuff, one, you can kind of get yourself in trouble. But two, you're going to have one of these companies that is really good in some areas and really poor in others. Or you're going to be one of these company commanders who's very good in the field when you're training, or if you're in a combat environment, but everything else is just kind of like in shambles, you know? And there are company commanders like that. And that's not what you want. Of course, war fighting is our number one priority. And you're trying to teach this to these young company commanders. I'm not trying to tell you that it is not important for you to have very high tactical competency. It is. But if that's all you have, you are way behind where you need to be. Because as a company commander, you got to manage all of this stuff because it's all going to contribute to general unit readiness. And you're going to not just put yourself at risk, but put your boss, your battalion commander, and even the brigade commander at risk if you have a company that poorly performs, because there are areas in which you're just not, there are gaps in your ability to command your company. So we need you to be well-rounded. 11, people are people. So we've already talked about people a little bit. I remember when I was in my process of applying to West Point, and I had to go take one of the physical aptitude tests as part of the application process. And so I was speaking to this retired officer in this area who was running this physical aptitude exam. I'm still in high school. I'm in my application process to be able to go to the academy. And I remember him telling me the Army and he said the Navy and the Air Force are about, equipment, but the Army is about people. Now, the Navy and the Air Force would probably, quibble with him about that. But even as a senior in high school, I understood what he was getting at. Because at the end of the day, you don't lead machines, you don't lead weapon systems, you lead people. And then people use those machines, people use that equipment, people use those weapon systems to be able to accomplish the mission or whatever. But you lead people. Now, I have said before, I even made a video about this called Principles First, Then People. And sometimes I think what I'm getting at is a little bit misunderstood. When I say principles first, then people, I am not saying people are not important. People are hugely important. What I mean by that, kind of that mantra there, principles first, then people, what I'm saying is I am specifically talking about when you are choosing to align yourself with people. Okay, what are the principles you care about? If you care about these principles, worry about that first, and then you will naturally align yourself with people who have similar principles. But if you seek to align yourself with the people first, then you find out that your principles are misaligned, that what you prioritize principle-wise is not the same as them, right? Okay. That is not to say that people are not important. People are hugely important. And the Army is about people, okay? And I worked with some great people. I had great leaders. I had great peers, great friends. I had people who were great that worked for me, and I'll tell you, another thing that I learned about people. I spent, so obviously, deployments to Afghanistan and particularly my later deployment, I worked very closely with Afghan forces and you learn ways in which, it's a very different culture, but you learn ways in which Afghans are not that different than Americans. Okay. Now I realize there's some stark differences in the culture. I got it. But people are people. I spent nearly 3 years in South Korea. Korea also has a very different culture. But you know what? A lot of what Koreans want with their lives, a lot of what Koreans care about are the same things that we care about. I spent a year in Honduras. And guess what? I worked a lot with particularly, some liaising with some of the Honduran armed forces a bit. And then I also, I was in Honduras for a year. And then I also spent a lot of time working with individuals from militaries or national police units from all over Latin America. And when I was in Korea or when I was in Afghanistan, I also worked with a lot of Aussies. I worked with a lot of Kiwis, Canadians, Brits, Danes. So, I had tremendous experiences with a lot of these people that were from different parts of the world. Some with cultures that we would consider to be similar to ours, and some from cultures that we would consider to be quite distinct. And I just have tremendous respect for a lot of these people, for their cultures, for their histories, and also for their concern for their own people, what it is that they are trying to achieve in their own country with their own people, whether that's the Afghans, whether that's the South Koreans, the Hondurans, or wherever, right? Here's another thing. People versus the mission. This one is a tricky one. In the military, this is important, particularly if you're a commander or you're a leader at some level. Understanding the tension that can occur between taking care of your people, but also accomplishing the mission. So when those two come into tension, what's more important, accomplishing the mission or taking care of your people? Well, it's going to depend on a variety of circumstances, but I will tell you this, and you're going to get differing answers on this. And I'm not going to give you a clear-cut answer as to which one is more important, because it depends on a variety of factors. But remember, there are certain circumstances in which lives are lost in the pursuit of accomplishing some sort of tactical or operational mission. Okay? Now, I'm not saying that means, therefore, in all situations, accomplishment of the mission is more important than the people. I'm not saying that. It depends on what the mission is. Depends on what the potential cost to the people is. There are plenty of missions in the military that are not worth the cost of someone's life or potential injury, right? So it just, again, it depends. It depends. But understanding that tension, being able to navigate the kind of the seam where the mission requirements kind of meet the needs of the people, is a requirement for good leaders in the military. I would say the same thing about other organizations as well, but it's really taken to a maximum level in the military because of the potential importance of the mission that you are trying to achieve, depending on what we're talking about, and also the potential cost to the people, which could be significant injury or perhaps even death. Again, if we're talking about, like extreme situations such as those you might find yourselves in combat. Okay, next one, physical fitness. Just got a couple others here. By the way, this is number 12. Physical fitness, very important. Oftentimes, this is the first thing that they see when you are a brand new lieutenant and you show up to your unit and you don't know a whole lot and you don't have a whole lot of expertise. Kind of the one thing that they would tell us at West Point is you better at least show up in shape, because that's the one thing you can control. And that helps with your confidence. So until you build your other skill set and kind of a level of expertise that allows you to have more competence in a well-rounded way, you can get by being in really good physical shape. Now, I'm not saying that should be mistaken for more than it is. There's kind of this joke out there. When I was in Korea, I had a colonel who would, kind of tell this joke where, he would kind of drive this point home. He would say, he would have this kind of this pretend conversation between like a battalion commander and a lieutenant in the battalion, and he would say, suppose the battalion commander says to the lieutenant, "Hey, Lieutenant so-and-so, what's the max effective range for an area target of a 240 Bravo?" And then whatever, just some question, some question that you might expect a lieutenant to know, and then um, about something tactical or whatever, right? And then the lieutenant answers, "Sir, I don't know, but I can do 120 push-ups," or "Sir, I don't know, but I can do 30 pull-ups." And then in this fictional scenario, the battalion commander responds, "That's a leader right there. Lieutenant is a great leader of men." Kind of, again, fictional scenario, kind of funny, but the point the colonel was trying to drive home was, if you're a lieutenant and you don't know anything, but you are very, very physically fit, you can kind of mask it, you can get by, and your superiors might even think that you're a great leader just because you're super physically fit, even if you bring nothing else to the table. Now, that there are some potential risks there. There are some downsides to that. But if you are physically fit, sometimes that's the first thing that people notice. Do you look like you're in shape? Are you in shape? Your first day in the unit, that morning at PT, physical training, were you in shape? So anyway, that was one of the things that I was known for in the military. I was always known for being in very, very good shape. Even when I was a major or whatever, I would do a lot of PT with the lieutenants. And when I was a platoon leader, when I was a lieutenant, some days I would run PT and I would call it death PT. Anyway, and then, later on, when I was a major and I was a brigade XO, people on the staff would want to do PT with me because they knew that I worked out very, very, very hard. And when I was a brigade executive officer and I worked out very hard every morning, there was a junior captain, a staff captain that was on brigade staff that felt like he was not where he needed to be in terms of his physical fitness, and he wanted to get in better shape. And he asked me, "Sir, can I start working out with you?" And I said, "Okay, but do you know what you're asking for?" And I would typically work out with the operations officer, who was another major. And this junior officer would work out with us every day. And he never, I mean, that dude puked in the beginning. He puked. There were other days in which he almost puked. But to his credit, for months and months until I left the unit, he worked out with us like every morning, regardless of how bad it was. So, give credit where credit is due. Good for him, right? So, yeah, I remember, yeah, just some of these physical fitness competitions that we would have. I remember one we did on one of my deployments to Afghanistan, and it was a huge deal. It was a huge deal. Just this massive competition, 120 competitors or whatever. And we did it on the way in to the deployment and on the way out. And when we did it first to come into the deployment, I won. So I won the competition, about 120 some odd competitors or whatever, but I won. And then on the way out, I did not win. I finished second. I was a major. There was a lieutenant that beat me. But anyway, being in shape is very important. And that leads me to my next one, kind of related to physical fitness, and that's toughness. So toughness is more than just physical fitness. It's, physical and mental, even psychological resilience. This just get it done mindset, that is hugely important in the military. Now, clearly that can be exploited. You can ask people to do things that are, borderline impossible or just unnecessarily risky, for no reason, right? Just unjustifiably risky, and then blame them for not being tough enough when they can't do it. Like that, that's too far. That's ridiculous. But toughness is a thing, and it's hard to quantify, but you know it when you see it, right? That's what you can say about toughness. And it's not always the biggest people. It's not always the most physically fit that are the toughest. I mean, there's some overlap between physical fitness and physical toughness, but there is a huge mental component to toughness. And you can be physically fit. Generally, if you're very physically fit, you're probably also physically tough, but they're not exactly the same thing. And you can have someone who is less physically fit than someone else, but more physically tough. And I'll give you an example. So, I was never a special forces officer, but I went through the special forces selection course, and I made it through. Like, I got selected, as they say. I just never went through the follow-on training through the qualification course, because at the time I was thinking about getting out of the Army. So anyway, I was never a special forces officer. I never went through the qualification course, which is the bulk of the training. It's like a year long. I went through the first course, which is only a couple of weeks long, but it is very intense. It is very rigorous. And you go through that, you get selected, and then you go through the qualification course. I never went through the qualification course. I just want to make that very clear because, I'm never trying to misrepresent myself as something that I'm not. But I did go through the special forces, what's called the selection course. And like I said, I made it through it. I did get selected. I just never went through the follow-on training. But I learned a lot from that course. It was very tough. It was very rigorous. It was very, very demanding. And this was after I'd already been through like Ranger and Sapper schools, and I felt like I was physically and mentally prepared for that type of course, and it was still very, very demanding. And but I remember something that we were told as we were kind of starting the course. We were told, hey, if all you bring to this course is that you are physically fit, it's not going to be enough, because this course is going to be so physically demanding that you're going to be broken down, that you're not going to be able to rely on your physical fitness. You're going to have to rely on toughness. Doesn't matter if you're an Olympic caliber athlete. Doesn't matter, because once you're torn down, you're going to have to rely on your toughness to make it through. And that's important. That is important when we think about putting people in situations where they have to rely on that toughness to be able to succeed. And that's one of the things that is important with military training, because you want to see who can dig deep, who is tough in a safe environment before it ever has to be demonstrated in a potential combat scenario. But also it proves to the individual themselves, like, hey, I can dig deep. Hey, I am tough. Hey, this was really hard and I made it through, and I learned something from it. Or I learned, hey, maybe I'm not quite as tough as I thought I was, or whatever, right? Because I will tell you, in some of those courses, man, there are times in those courses where you can really start to feel sorry for yourself. You go to any of those courses, one of the things in all those courses that they do is what's called land navigation. And this is such a great metaphor for life. So land navigation is exactly what it sounds like. You may have heard of like orienteering or whatever, but anyway, land navigation is where you have a map and a compass, and you were trying to get from, point A to point B. Okay. And in these courses and in other Army units where, you train, this is a skill that is necessary, because even when you're in a combat environment, you got to know how to get to where your objective is. And you may be traveling through uneven terrain. You may be going through dense vegetation. You may be in an urban environment, or you may be in a desert environment, whatever, right? So it is a skill that is necessary. However, there's another component that I am convinced that is also why it is so heavily used in these courses. And that is because it's more than just about testing the skill, like just the navigation skill per se. Okay, so do you know how to use a compass? Do you know how to use, terrain association to kind of look at the map, look at the terrain around you, be able to read the map relative to the ground around you, use a compass, and then be able to move from point A to point B. Okay, while that skill is necessary and super important, I think the utility of land navigation in those courses goes beyond just, testing that skill. It's there is just, when you are by yourself and you've been by yourself in the woods for several hours, and you're walking along and you're potentially lost, and oh, by the way, it may or may not be dark, because all those courses, You're going to be doing that, at night as well, right? And you're walking along. I mean, you can really start to feel sorry for yourself. You're carrying your pack probably. You got your weapon. You may be walking through very dense vegetation, and your feet are sore. You're very, very tired. You're not exactly sure if you're even walking in the right direction, or you think you're where you're supposed to be, and you're looking for the point and you can't find it. You're like, man. I mean, you can really start to feel sorry for yourself and question some of your life decisions, right? And I think continuing to drive on and move forward when you're all alone, kind of, I think that really requires some toughness. Credentialing. So, what would I say about credentialing? Well, credentials do and don't matter. This is number 14, by the way. I promise we're getting close to the end. So, credentials in the Army or credentials in some other, facet of life, sometimes you need professional licensing or credentials to be able to even hold a certain occupation or a certain position at wherever, right? Well, in the Army, what kind of credentials are there, and what matters and doesn't matter, right? Well, I would say credentials must recognize, reward, and thus reinforce the right things. Remember when I said earlier, when you're doing the small things have to lead you to the big things. Otherwise, you're going to focus attention on small things that don't get you to big successes, which could be lost time. There's a potential trade-off there, right? Well, one of the credentials that is spoken about so much, and I've already referred to it multiple times today, is Ranger School or the Ranger Tab. This is something that is recognized all throughout the Army. You go to a course, and you graduate from the course, and you get a tab that you wear on your left shoulder. The Ranger Tab, and a very small percentage of the Army is Ranger qualified. And so it is considered to be, somewhat prestigious if you have been through the course and earned your Ranger tab. And if you're in an infantry battalion and you're a lieutenant, that's a big deal. Even if you're, and I was not an infantryman, I was a combat engineer. But in a combat engineer battalion, having a Ranger tab is a big deal and can be a distinguisher between you and other individuals. The same with the sapper tab. So, in the Army, there's kind of this ongoing debate. Do we need to wear tabs and badges at all? Do you need to wear the Ranger tab? Do you need to wear the Special Forces tab? Do you need to wear the, your parachutist badge, your airborne wings or your air assault wings or your combat infantryman's badge or your combat action badge or whatever it is, right? Do we need to wear those? And what about some schools have a tab or a badge and others don't? So where do we draw the line between what does or does not have a tab or a badge and what doesn't? So there's kind of a funny story here. So I was a platoon leader. This is in late 2005. And I was finishing sapper school. It was my second time through sapper school. This is the time that I went through and actually graduated. And I had just been to Ranger School a couple months earlier and had graduated. By the way, if you go to sapper school and you're Ranger qualified, you will be picked on a lot by the SIs, the sapper instructors. And at the time that I went, all sapper instructors were Ranger qualified. It was a requirement. And so they're all Ranger qualified. But if you're a sapper student going through and you're Ranger qualified, they will mess with you a lot. But, it's cool. It's all in good fun. So at the end of sapper school, one of the instructors approached me and he said, "Hey, I'm going to be your platoon sergeant." And I was like, okay. I was like, well, and I was a platoon leader at this time. I'd taken a month and I'd gone to, sapper school with some of the guys from my platoon, by the way. And I remember thinking, well, it's true that my previous platoon sergeant is leaving. That's true. He's going to go be a drill instructor. But I'm pretty sure I already know who the replacement is. Well, lo and behold, I returned back to home station at Fort Drum, New York. And this sergeant, the sergeant first class, who had been a sapper instructor for 4 years, he shows up. So he finishes his time as a sapper instructor, shows up to the 10th Mountain Division, shows up in my battalion in my company, and lo and behold, he becomes my platoon sergeant. And so he was funny. So this is 2005. I had not yet deployed. You got to think. So I enter the Army in the summer of 2003. We go as a military, we go into Afghanistan in the fall of 2001 and into Iraq in the spring of 03. But by the summer of 05, I had not deployed yet. I'd been in the Army for 2 years and I had not deployed yet. And I felt like I was the last person in the world to deploy. And I wouldn't deploy until January of 06. Well, this is late 05. And now this guy has shown up. He's my new platoon sergeant. And he is Ranger qualified. He is Sapper qualified. He's, air assault, Pathfinder, for those of you who know what these terms mean. He was a master parachutist, but he did not have a combat patch. And I didn't either, because he had been a Sapper instructor for 4 years. So he had been a Sapper instructor since 2001, when kind of the global war on terror had kicked off. But he was amazingly competent, super physically fit. Sapper instructors are, very highly skilled guys, but neither one of us had deployed yet. And I remember the boys, the guys in the platoon, they were a little bit afraid of him because he was kind of an intimidating guy when he showed up, but he was great guy and great platoon sergeant and a great coach, mentor, trainer for the platoon. But the boys were a little bit intimidated by him when he showed up. But I remember he and I were going to go. When you're a combat engineer, you directly support the infantry, and so you will have like a platoon that will work with an infantry battalion. And so as the platoon leader, we had this working relationship with this infantry battalion. And so my platoon sergeant and I were going to go over and we were going to meet the company commanders of this battalion we were working with. So we're going to go into infantry land and we're going to go and we're going to meet these infantry company commanders. And I remember my platoon sergeant saying, both of us were Ranger and Sapper qualified. Neither one of us had a combat patch at the time. It was a big deal. These things matter. Whether they should or shouldn't, but these things matter at the time. And I still remember to this day, he said, "Hey, so we have an appointment. We're going to go meet this company commander, and we're approaching his office." And I remember my platoon sergeant said, "Hey, when we go in the door, we need to left step march into the door." Now he was joking, but what he meant was, so a left step march would be like literally, moving like to the side, moving left. So what he meant was lead with your left shoulder into the door so that he can see that you're Ranger and Sapper qualified. Hide your right shoulder, which is where your combat patch would be, which we don't have. So it's kind of funny. So it's kind of a funny story about credentialing, about showing up and wanting to be recognized for the credentials you have, and trying to mask, the fact that there are other credentials such as combat experience that you don't yet have. Now, of course, I would go on and deploy multiple times, and this platoon sergeant of mine would also go on and deploy multiple times. But kind of a funny story at the time. Left step march into the office, lead with your left shoulder. Okay, kind of coming to the end here. Loyalty. There was kind of this idea, this saying at West Point. The honor code is a huge thing at West Point. And so there was this saying that would go along with the honor code, not officially part of the honor code, but just kind of this saying that was loyalty above all else except honor. So what that meant was, if someone did something, like your friend, your classmate, your roommate, whatever, right? Your loyalty to them as a friend should not be placed above, honor. If someone were to come to you and say, "Hey, do you know who did that?" Your loyalty to your friend might lead you to say, "No, I don't know who did that." Which, according to the honor code, would be wrong because, according to the honor code at West Point, which is taken very, very, very seriously, A cadet does not lie, cheat, or steal, or tolerate those who do. And so this idea that, hey, loyalty is important. We teach cadets to be part of a team. That requires loyalty to the team, loyalty to, the person to your left or your right, potentially in a combat scenario. So loyalty is incredibly important. Putting the needs of the unit above your own requires loyalty. So you also have to kind of learn, though, but loyalty can have its limitations. It's not a mafia. And I remember a situation where I was a major. I was having a conversation with, I was in a unit in which there was a commander. There were various opinions about the leadership style of a particular commander in this unit. Some people would have said this guy is a super innovative, transformational leader, and others would have said this guy is toxic. And I remember talking to someone who had been in that unit, and I remember him saying, that unit, loyalty was considered to be like the highest virtue. And if you did something against the unit, or you spoke out against the unit, he said that was the unpardonable sin there, and he said it was like the mafia, where loyalty to the unit first and foremost. That can be dangerous. Where you're putting loyalty above some other principles, right? But aside from those extreme circumstances, loyalty is a virtue that must be cultivated and should be cultivated in the military. But yeah, I mean, I've been in situations where it's like, are you in this person's circle or are you in this person's circle? When I was a major, a battalion operations officer, my boss, the battalion commander, was fired. My battalion commander was supposed to deploy. So half our battalion was going to deploy. The battalion commander was going to deploy. I, as the battalion operations officer, was going to deploy with about half of the battalion. The other half of the battalion was staying back with the executive officer. When the battalion commander didn't deploy, I was the highest ranking person in the battalion that deployed. Battalion commander, for reasons that I won't go into here, did not deploy and was eventually relieved of command. But there were situations leading up to that where I had to ask myself, where do my loyalties lie? Do my loyalties lie with my battalion commander, my direct boss, with the brigade commander, who the battalion commander reports to, with the battalion, and out of loyalty to the brigade commander and to the battalion, like the soldiers, am I going to have to speak out against the battalion commander, my direct boss? I mean, this was a crazy situation, that I found myself in, because of the battalion commander's actions that were done and things that should have been done that weren't done, and just a failure to perform in a pretty significant way. And I remember there was something that the battalion commander did. I'm a major, the battalion commander is a lieutenant colonel, and my direct boss, right? And I remember we were starting to deploy, and the brigade commander had already deployed to Afghanistan. We were getting ready to deploy. And we had a deputy brigade commander who was going to stay back. He was a full colonel as well. So I remember I'm a major, I'm the operations officer in the battalion. I remember having a conversation with the other major in the battalion, who is the executive officer, who incidentally was a good friend of mine and who I had known at West Point, and who, as lieutenants, we've been roommates together. So I knew him really well. I had known him since West Point. He's a great guy. And I remember telling him, hey, we're in a situation where I'm going to have to go talk to the deputy brigade commander. Like, this is what is happening is unacceptable. And I don't feel good about this. I don't even know what I'm going to say. But out of loyalty to our unit and out of loyalty to the brigade, I'm going to have to go and kind of speak out against the battalion commander. Like, there's some things here that just, it's been going on too long. And I said, I'm going. You can come with me, but I'm not asking you to. I'm just letting you know that I'm going. You're free to come with me or what. And he said, I'll go with you. So the two of us went. We went to the deputy brigade commander's office, knocked on his door. He saw the two of us there, knew exactly what we were there to talk about. And we went in, and I just remember telling him, hey, sir, I don't even know how to say what I'm about ready to tell you, but here's kind of the situation that we're in. Anyway, so it's just kind of one of those situations where, competing loyalties, and you're trying to navigate this situation, and you're like, what is going on here? I don't want to be in this situation, but I'm in this situation. What's the right thing to do? I'm not trying to destroy anybody's career, but I want what's best for everybody. But there are, there are competing priorities here, and I'm just trying to do the right thing. And I'm trying to express my loyalty in the way that is most appropriate at this time, right? And the last thing I'll talk about is trust. So knowing what's right, knowing that others know what's right, doing what's right, being trusted to know what to do. I mentioned before that I had a commander that I always felt like, was the smartest person in the room. And I mean that in a good way. A very cerebral thinker, very hard worker, very, very competent. And you felt, I mean, it was kind of hard to work for because he was very driven and had very high standards. But you felt, but you knew you could rely on him, and then he would not violate anyone's trust. Reputation is important in the military and in many other areas of life as well. But certainly in the military, we think of it as a very large organization. But you hear all the time people say, "Hey, it's a small army. It's a small army." What they mean by that is, particularly as you go up in rank, by the time you're a colonel, which I never was, I was only a lieutenant colonel, but a lot of colonels, they know each other, or at least they know each other by reputation. And I mentioned earlier that influence is a currency when we're talking about leadership, but trust is also a currency. And I remember I had a boss, this was in Honduras, and I had a boss that, he would always talk about how so-and-so or so-and-so was a trusted agent. And what he meant was, he was the commander of the task force, but he would have these officers that he would entrust with certain things because he knew that if I put you in charge of this, I know you're going to handle it. You're going to get it done. And so if you ever heard him refer to you as one of his trusted agents, that meant that you were kind of, he felt like you could be entrusted with certain tasks or requirements that were, big ticket items, and he would trust you to get it done. So I remember always being proud of the fact that, that he considered me a trusted agent. Anyway, so yeah, trust is very important as well. So I said I would tell you 10 things that that I learned in the Army. I think it was more like 16, so a little bit of extra credit there. And I've gone for a very, very long time now. So anyway, I hope this means something to you. Happy birthday to the Army. I didn't want to just rag on the Army as an institution today. I wanted to talk about something more positive and maybe in kind of a lighthearted spirit. Some of this is serious. I mean, these are important things to learn, but also you can look at it as, hey, here are kind of some funny stories that maybe highlight there's an important lesson to be learned, but we can maybe see it reflected in a humorous story. So anyway, hopefully you found this enlightening or maybe amusing or both, and I appreciate you sticking around.